Hello, welcome everyone. We're going to get started with Chapter 2 now. And Chapter 2 covers job order costing. And the first learning objective in Chapter 2 is really it explains the differences between process costing and job order costing. Now, we're going to cover process costing in Chapter 4. Chapter 2 covers job order costing, but it does start with distinguishing between the two. And in a nutshell, process costing is used by companies that primarily produce one unit of production, where each merchandise inventory that they are creating, every unit of production, is pretty much indistinguishable or identical to all other units of production. Some example would be a Weyerhaeuser, which is a paper manufacturer. I think Reynolds Aluminum, they're basically making aluminum ingots, which basically are indistinguishable one from another. And Coca-Cola is a good example as well. And generally, even Coca-Cola, though they make various different sodas or soft drinks the way we know them, usually they'll have manufacturing plants set up where they bottle or can one specific kind, be it Sprite or Coke, and each one is indistinguishable from another. So process costing would be appropriate there. But what we're going to be covering in Chapter 2 is job order costing. And as really based on each job or each order from a customer is unique or custom. So the company will be building something unique every time. All the products that they create are easily distinguishable from one another, and they're customized type of thing, kind of made to order. And because of that, we need to allocate or trace costs on an individual basis by job. Some examples of companies that would use job order costing or that create unique and customized products would be Boeing. Generally, they will take orders for a certain number of planes or jets and make them unique for that customer. Even Disney Studios is given as a good example. Movies are indeed units of production, and each one is obviously distinguishable from another. The way job order costing works on an overview is basically you apply the three costs of manufacturing to each job. So first you start with direct materials and apply the exact amount that was used in each job to each job. Then, of course, you apply the direct labor to each job. And remember, direct materials and direct labor are actual things that can be traced easily to individual units of production. So tracing these amounts would be fairly simple. The problem comes in, of course, with manufacturing overhead. Remember, manufacturing overhead is all the other costs that cannot be directly and easily traced to individual units of production, but all the other costs that are related to manufacturing or production or to the factory. Keep an eye out every time you have a question, albeit in homework or in exams, if it is talking about manufacturing costs or production costs or factory costs. These are all synonyms that they will use. And it cannot be, it's not direct materials and it is not direct labor. It goes into manufacturing overhead, which also needs to be applied to the jobs. Because remember, the cost of the inventory that we are making, the units of production, involves these three main elements: direct materials, direct labor, and everything else, every other cost that is associated with manufacturing or production of those goods. So the last thing we will do is, once we've accumulated all the costs of manufacturing overhead, we then apply manufacturing overhead based upon some sort of rate that we will determine, and we'll talk about that in just a bit. It's a predetermined overhead rate. That will be based on an estimate, of course, and we'll get to just how we do that in a bit. And remember, manufacturing overhead includes things like rent for the manufacturing plant, maintenance for the machines, the maintenance man's salary, manager's salary, everyone else who works there's salary but isn't a direct laborer on those products or units of production. And Chapter 2 also introduces documents that might be used in a job order costing system. And I'm going to show you some of them, but please don't feel the need to memorize them. I think they just help us with an example. So let's assume in our example that our company, Pear Company, creates wooden products for people, and they will make them to order. And so I've throwing in a photo here. I want us to assume that our customer has come along and ordered 2 wooden cargo crates for carrying some sort of livestock. You'll see what I've got here, live animals. Just an example of something that we might be creating. And so we'd prepare first a job cost sheet, and this is going to accumulate everything we need: the direct materials, the direct labor, and the manufacturing overhead. So once we get this order, a sales manager or a production manager might create this product and get it into production. The first thing, of course, is it would be given to whoever is in charge of making these things, and they need to determine what sort of materials would be needed for this product. So let's assume that our skilled craftsman decides, okay, I'm going to need several 2x4s, 12 of them to be exact, and they're going to be 12 feet long each, and I'm going to need several 1x6s. Again, don't feel you need to memorize these documents. It's just an example to go through. And we know what the cost for each of those 2x4s and 1x6s pieces of wood would be. So multiply out the quantity by the actual cost to us. Multiply that out, add it up, we know we're going to need $116 of direct materials to build these 2 wooden crates. So we would bring that back to the job cost sheet, right? The total materials that would be needed. That's the cost. Next, of course, is the direct labor. Let's assume that we have a very skilled craftsman, and his name is I Am Skilled, of course. And this is his timesheet, basically, and he's working on our job for this customer. He starts, it looks like, at 8 a.m., works till noon, takes a 1-hour lunch, starts up again at 1 p.m., finishes the job at 5 p.m. So 4 hours in the morning, 4 in the afternoon, total 8 hours, and we pay him $11 per hour. If we multiply that out, we're talking about $88. That's the direct labor cost. And again, this is the man who is actually, man or woman, that is building our box for us. So their salary can be specifically and easily traced to these units of production, right? We know that these 2 wooden crates will take $88 of direct labor to make and $116 of direct materials to make. The problem is that these aren't the only costs to create these things, right? They've got to take a portion, they've got to share a portion of the rent, of the depreciation of the machines, of the manager's salary, of the secretary's salary, of the security guard's salary, every other expense that is related to the manufacturing or factory operations. A part of that needs to be applied to these 2 wooden crates that we've created. Otherwise, we won't be pricing these things well. So, how do we apply manufacturing overhead? The way we do that is we use some sort of an allocation base, like direct labor hours or direct labor dollars, and we take a total of what the company expects to have during a period, and then we will apply it to individual jobs. And the reason we use an allocation base is because it's simply impossible to trace overhead costs to a particular job. And what I mean by that is, consider that manufacturing overhead has all sorts of costs, which we've discussed only a fraction of them. I think I mentioned at one point, imagine that in the manufacturing plant there's a coffee machine, and we provide for our laborers free coffee, right? We buy it for them. Now, the cost of even coffee has to be applied to each individual unit of production. We need to. That is part of the cost of building those wooden boxes, right? Some tiny fraction of the coffee. Even things, don't mean to be crude, but things like paper towels that we purchase for the facility. And how do you possibly allocate a part or trace a part of that cost of paper towels or small supplies that we use at the manufacturing plant to individual boxes? Well, it's impossible. You'd be talking about fractions of pennies. So what we do is we accumulate all the manufacturing overhead costs, everything that's related to manufacturing that is not direct labor and not direct materials, we accumulate in the manufacturing overhead account, and then we will apply it individually using some rate. Let's go ahead and go into what that is and how we compute a predetermined overhead rate. This is the basic formula here. We take the estimated total manufacturing overhead costs for the coming period, maybe year, maybe month, depending. So we take the estimate of manufacturing overhead costs and divide by the estimated number of units in our allocation base. Now that allocation base will be many different things, but ideally what we want it to be is something that actually drives overhead. In other words, if we are a heavily automated manufacturing facility, we would want to use maybe machine hours, the amount of time that the machines are being used, because the more they are being used, the more costs we're going to incur related to manufacturing. What I mean is electricity is going to be higher, most likely salary is going to be higher because we're going to have people there working and monitoring the machines. Maintenance costs are going to be higher, so the longer we run our machines, obviously, the more manufacturing costs, particularly overhead costs, we are going to have. If we're not, if we were a heavy labor manufacturing company, we may want to use direct labor hours, right? Because the more labor hours that we use, the more people that are running, that are actually working and creating products for us, the more we will be incurring other overhead costs associated with that. By the way, you will never be responsible for estimating manufacturing overhead costs or estimating the number of units or the allocation base or coming up with which allocation base we should use. This is something that business managers will do and provide to us. So in all of the problems you'll be doing in this chapter, and including both homework and exams, these amounts will be given to you. You just need to know the formula for coming up with the predetermined overhead rate, which is right here. Now, we use a predetermined overhead rate, and we come up with it in the beginning of the period. And, of course, it's impossible to predict exactly what costs are going to be. Generally, it'll be based on something previously. And, again, this will be done for you. But the reason we do it ahead of time is because we want to be able to price our products correctly. For example, if we waited till the very end of the period to actually apply overhead, we would be missing a very big piece of the cost. And what I mean by that is, imagine if we're building these boxes and not including a very big piece of the costs, all the manufacturing overhead costs. If we didn't put that in there, we might price these things too low and actually be losing money. So we need to have this for decision-making purposes ahead of time, or at least in a timely fashion, to keep our prices that we are going to be selling these products at least competitive and in the profit margin zone. So predetermined overhead rate is going to be based upon our estimates at the beginning, and then once we know what the allocation base is, we will multiply that predetermined overhead rate by whatever the actual activity is that we have incurred during a job. So let's jump back to our pear company example, right? We estimate, and let's assume that we estimated at the beginning of the period that the total amount of manufacturing overhead was going to be $640,000. And since we are a very labor-intensive manufacturing operation, our company uses direct labor hours as an allocation base. So, knowing that, what would be our predetermined overhead rate? Very simple. We just plug those into the formula here. Remember, the estimate of manufacturing overhead divided by the estimate of the allocation base we plan on using. Divide that out, and it's $4, right, per direct labor hour. And what that means is in every job that we have, for each direct labor hour that that job uses, we will apply $4 of overhead to it. So let's go ahead and jump back to our example. Remember, our predetermined overhead rate is $4 per direct labor hour. How much manufacturing overhead rate would we apply to this job? Well, we know that our direct labor hours are 8, so we are going to apply that $4 per direct labor hour, right? Manufacturing overhead, we will take 8 hours multiplied by our predetermined overhead rate and $32. And so now, the total cost of these boxes that we've created, wooden crates for livestock for our customer, have the materials, have the labor that it actually took to build these boxes, and a portion of everything else, the electricity, the rent, the coffee, the salary of the managers, the salary of the security guard that works at our manufacturing facility, and every other cost. There are literally infinite number of costs that we cannot come up with, but these are just a few examples, and the book gives it as well. So now if you take all of these amounts, add them up, what you've got here is your direct materials, your direct labor, your manufacturing overhead. Add those up, that's the total cost, and of course we built 2 crates, so each crate ended up costing us $118. Now, if we did not know that manufacturing overhead rate, we would think that our cost is significantly less. Now we know at least a very good, timely estimate of what these boxes cost us to create, and we can, of course, quote a reasonable price as long as it's over $118 to our customer. All right. And I think we'll stop there for the first part of Chapter 2. I'll see you guys in Part 2.